Hi, good afternoon. My name is Laurance Stuntz. I'm the director of the Massachusetts eHealth Institute, the Mass Tech Collaborative, or MeHI, and we're one of the founding members of the Massachusetts Caregiver Coalition. The coalition, which is a group of leading employers, advocates, and government partners committed to recognizing, honoring, and supporting unpaid caregivers working across the Commonwealth, is sponsoring this Caring for the Caregiver webinar series. Before we get going, I'd like to just make a couple of quick housekeeping items. First of all, we'll share a recording of the webinar with all registrants following the event. And you can also find our past videos and past webinar recordings on our YouTube channel if you search for Mass Caregiving Coalition, Massachusetts Caregiving Coalition. And closed captioning is available for those who need it. It is automated, so some of the language gets interesting. It can be turned on or off individually by pressing the CC button at the bottom of the screen. Lastly, we encourage you to submit questions for our speakers by pressing the Q&A button and typing your question during the panel. We've allotted about 15 minutes at the end of the discussion for questions and answers, and they can be for any of our speakers. So with that, I will start the webinar. So today's webinar, employer responses to the COVID pandemic. We'll look at what it means to be a family caregiver and an employer of caregivers during the COVID-19 pandemic, and especially as Delta has been surging and as many companies are starting to bring people back to work in person. It'll be interesting to hear about employer attitudes, employee attitudes, and how employers can support their caregiving employees. So we will hear from several folks. We always like to include a caregiving story. So we have Laureen Granger as describing some of her story and the way that she was supported by her employer. We'll hear from the CEO of the Mass Business Roundtable, talking about how the Roundtable's members, some of the Commonwealth's leading employers, are responding to their employees' challenges. And then we have a panel moderated by Liz O'Donnell of Working Daughter that will include AARP, discussing their report, Caregivers Stressed About Returning to Work After COVID, and from Wellthy, Lindsay, Jurist, Rosner, discussing the role of workplace benefits and how they support employers and some of their experience working on supporting caregivers. So without further ado, let me introduce JD Chesloff. JD is President and CEO of the Massachusetts Business Roundtable. The Business Roundtable was a co-founder of the coalition with Mass Tech and with Cigna, Archangels, and several other large organizations, Senior Link, EMD Sorono, and others. And at the Business Roundtable, JD is responsible for developing and implementing the strategic framework and direction for MBR in partnership with the chair, executive committee, and board of directors. He works through the MBR task forces and leadership to develop its agenda on public policy matters, and to convey those ideas to opinion leaders and policymakers to help inform their deliberations, easy for me to say. And JD's going to talk a little bit about the roundtable members and what they've done and the experiences that they're having as folks start to come back to work. JD, do you mind joining me on screen, and I'll drop off.
Great. Thank you, Laurance.
Welcome.
And good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the introduction, Laurance. We're thrilled to be a founding member of the coalition and continued active partner in the work. So just a little bit of background. So the Roundtable is a group of about 90 CEOs, senior executives from generally large employers across the state, working on state public policy issues. We break out into a variety of task forces, as Laurance mentioned. And we had a member join a couple of years ago, a guy named Mark Butler, who is the regional executive for Cigna Healthcare. And he said, I want to convene members to look at innovative business practices. Let's just share best practices on a topic that comes up in the conversation. And so that group met probably about 20, a couple dozen or so over the course of a few months. And what emerged was this focus on caregiving and a lot of kind of aha moments in the room that not only are some of the executives themselves caregivers, but of course, they're employing a whole lot of caregivers. And this led to a variety of conversations, which eventually helped lead to the creation of this coalition. Fast forward to this past summer, where I spend every summer meeting one-on-one with members of the roundtable and asked them basically, what's happening in your industry? What's happening in your company? What are you seeing out there? And we had 5 takeaways this year. I'm not going to run through all of them, but I am going to highlight one, because the number of people that mentioned mental health and wellness was surprising to me. It clearly is a priority for employers. And when we're asking them what is driving that, it's predominantly this shift to remote work and remote work from home. And some of the stressors that come along with that: isolation, flexibility in the hours that you work, which make for a much longer workday, separation of work and home. But what came up most often was caregiving, childcare, elder care, care for a parent. The caregiving responsibilities of employees have become very, very top of mind for employers. And employers are thinking more strategically about how to respond to that. Honestly, there's been a shift, or there's a shift happening between the employer-employee relationship in terms of how the employer supports their employee. And Care.com did a super report on this. But if you think about it, if you're not bringing people to an office for 40 hours a week, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, then parking may have less value. An on-site fitness center may have less value. A subsidized cafeteria may have less value. But what is valuable to folks who are working remotely? You start to think about mental health and wellness supports, childcare supports, caregiving supports, technology supports. It's a really different way of thinking about that relationship. And honestly, as employees are navigating this new remote work from home hybrid model work environment, they are demanding this of employers more and more. I would just end by saying this. The world has fundamentally changed in where and how people work. Again, these are roundtable members who can afford to, or have the luxury actually, of being able to offer a remote work environment or a hybrid work environment. Not all employers do, and I recognize that. For those that do, such as roundtable members, there really has been a dramatic change in where and how people work, and then how an employer responds to that. And as you're going to hear from other speakers today and the panel later, employers have to be innovative and thoughtful about how they are responding to this phenomenon so that they can compete for talent. I mentioned before that we have these 5 takeaways. The number 1 takeaway was a severe talent shortage and intense competition for talent. And I think that's directly tied to this conversation around caregiving, around flexibility, around benefits, around how employers are supporting their employees, not only because it's the right thing to do for them, but because it's also a business imperative as competition for talent heats up. So let me stop there, Laurance. It's a little bit about what we heard. Happy to address a little bit more later in the Q&A, but this is a priority issue and very much top of mind for employers across the state.
Great, thank you very much, JD. And it's really interesting to hear how important employers feel that support for caregivers, support for their caregiving employees is just as part of a talent retention strategy. We've heard this sort of time called the Great Resignation, where the people, for whatever reason, are leaving their employers, and it can be really difficult to create culture and so on. And hopefully, caregiving and support for caregivers can be a part of that for employers. So, as our next piece of the webinar, I'm going to invite Laureen Granger on. Laureen has been a part of the management team for backup child and care and adult care operations at Care.com for several years. She started her career as a full-time nanny and then transitioned into matching families with care providers at Parents in a Pinch, which was acquired by Care.com wow, you've been there 8 years now, Laureen, in 2013. Laureen currently supports the Care at Work Enterprise Solutions team with workforce management productivity assessment, and as a liaison with product development. And she's passionate about the Care.com mission of helping families to find quality care for their loved ones while also providing opportunities for caregivers to be paid fairly and to obtain professional benefits. And one of the things we like to do with these webinars is bring a sort of a personal touch to this. And Laureen has graciously agreed to provide that personal touch today and share a little bit of her story as a caregiver and as an employee. Laureen, thank you so much.
Thank you, Laurance. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Obviously, this is my personal story, so I hope I don't get too emotional. I may tear up a little bit, but don't worry, it has a happy ending. So my mother is in her 80s. She's generally in pretty good health and is living in an independent living situation. And she lives about 5 hours away from me. I have a sister that also, cares for my mother. And again, this is not a day-to-day. We need to care for her daily needs, but, we are responsible for making sure that she has what she needs. And in April, actually on the day she was scheduled to get her first shot of the vaccine, my mother fell unexpectedly and at first inexplicably. And my sister and I were informed of this. My sister's also very physically distant. And of course, this was still when there were a lot of precautions in place. Even before the Delta variant, most people had not been vaccinated yet. I had no idea if I was going to be allowed to visit her in the hospital. It turns out that, she could only have a very limited number of visitors. I didn't know what was really happening with her. I didn't know how COVID was going to impact it. I didn't know anything. I heard this and my first gut response was, I have no idea what to do. And I think many people, even without COVID, find themselves in that situation when it comes to caring for adult and senior loved ones, because we just don't know when they're going to start to deteriorate physically and when they're going to have needs that come up all of the sudden. I'm sure everyone here with older parents can relate, or even with grandparents. But I also knew that I worked for a company that was very invested in supporting their employees, and helping other employers support their employees. So at least I had that moment of, well, I'm not going to lose my job over this. And in fact, I know that my immediate boss was going to be very compassionate and understanding. I knew that our CEO had mentioned time and again that we all need to be supportive of each other and flexible, especially in these difficult times. And luckily, we do have a benefit called senior care planning for those people like me who are like, I just don't even know what the first step is. I have no idea. I knew that my mother was probably going to be in the hospital for a while and that she was probably going to need some kind of rehabilitation, because once she got there, she had a stroke. So we think she was having, TIAs, which are, I guess, baby strokes, and that's what caused her to fall. And then while she was being examined as a result of the fall, she did have a stroke, and luckily she was in the right place and was able to receive care. But of course, I'm hearing all of this secondhand. So what I did was I took advantage of first that one benefit of the senior care planning, and I was able to get in touch with someone, her name is Sherry, at my company, who's one of the senior care advisors. And the first thing she did for me really was just to give me a sounding board. I didn't have to worry about how I said it or what I said, because I knew it was confidential. I wasn't talking to a fellow family member, so I didn't have to worry about saying something that, they would consider insensitive. I could really just express what my fears were, my concerns, my questions. And she first off just reassured me that, she had access to a lot of information and resources that she would be happy to provide me with, and that she would always be happy to listen. And I was able to also get her in touch with my sister, who was also a caregiver of my mother. It all worked out. Sherry helped us find a really excellent facility for when my mother was ready to be released from the hospital, but not quite ready to be at home yet. And then once she was going to be at home, the backup care team helped me figure out a solution for some temporary care for her the first couple of days she was at home to help her settle back in. And I have to say, it really made me feel very grateful to be working at care.com, to have employers that supported me, that understood that, I can't work efficiently if I'm worried about my mom. So that's basically my story. I hope all of you, if you ever are in similar situations, have as much support and understanding as I had.
Laureen, thank you very much. It can be tough to share these stories, and I'm glad that your mom's in a better place. I'm glad that it has worked out. And I think one of the things that strikes me as you're talking about that is the sort of the hopefully improved connection with your employer due to the support, because one of the things I know a lot of employers that I talk to want is to create community, and one way to do that is to provide support outside of work. And so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Story. So now we're going to move to our panel. Our panel is moderated by Liz O'Donnell. Liz is the founder of Working Daughter, a community for women balancing elder care, career, and more. And as an award-winning writer, her latest book, Working Daughter, A Guide to Caring for Your Aging Parents While Earning a Living, was named one of the best books of 2019 by Library Journal. In 2020, she launched the first National Working Daughters Day. And as a former family caregiver, both of her parents happened to have been diagnosed with terminal illnesses on the same day. She is a recognized expert on working while caregiving and has written on the topic for many outlets, including The Atlantic, Harvard Business Review, Fast Company, Forbes, Time, WBUR, PBS's Next Avenue, and has been quoted on the topic by Oprah Magazine, CNBC, The Lily, and others, and has been featured in Health and in Aussie media. Liz, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I'll leave it to you to introduce your panelists, and I look forward to hearing the conversation.
Excellent. Thank you, Laurance. When I was caring for my parents, one of the most challenging aspects for me was the balancing care and going to work. So I'm thrilled to be having this conversation today. And with me is Tricia Sandiego from AARP. Hello, Tricia. Tricia is a senior advisor for AARP's Caregiving and Health team, and she's a certified health education specialist. She leads AARP's employer outreach activities and engages with employers and helps them support working family caregivers, to which I say, hallelujah, great work. Thank you for being here. And also join us, please, Lindsay, Jarris, Rosner. Lindsay is the CEO and co-founder of Wellthy, and Wellthy helps individuals and families manage and coordinate care for family members who might be chronically ill, aging, disabled, lots of complex care issues going on. And she draws on her own experience as a caregiver in running Wellthy. Lindsay actually started caregiving at the age of 9, which is pretty incredible. So welcome to both of you. And Tricia, let's start with you. Let's start with this report that was mentioned earlier. AARP recently issued this report titled Working Caregivers, Concerns and Desires in a Post-Pandemic World. What are some of the top findings and key takeaways there?
Sure. It's data that we released in end of July, early August, and I'll give you some of the key highlights from there. We learned that 75% of caregivers are worrying about juggling work and caregiving duties once they return to the office, and that 2/3 of caregivers feel that they're going to be concerned for the next 12 months. We also learned that more than half of caregivers say that they receive flexible schedules during the pandemic, at least part-time, and that 20% are still sort of continuing in that capacity. 30% are sort of doing a hybrid situation already. We also learned that more than 4 in 10 say they would consider looking for a new job if their employer rolls back these benefits. And that stat, I've seen higher numbers reported in other surveys and other studies, and it fluctuates. And that's what we're seeing as contributing to this great resignation effect that we're hearing so much about, that was mentioned earlier. 4 in 10 saying that they're considering looking for a new job if their employer rolls back. I've seen it as high as 7 in 10. Women of color saying that they would leave the workforce if they had to in order to provide care and to balance this work and caregiving that you referenced, Liz, is so difficult to do.
Yeah, you pulled out the statistic that jumped out for me the most, which was that 40% number that caregivers would consider looking for a new job if their benefits were rolled back. I think it's really important to underscore that, and it does indeed speak to this Great Resignation. And one of the things I think we know about the Great Resignation too, according to the Bureau of Labor, is that in stats is that healthcare is one of the most impacted segments in the Great Resignation, and also a huge segment here in Massachusetts. And Lindsay, you had some thoughts on the healthcare industry specifically. I would love to hear more about that. And then also, I'm going to lead in with two questions for you. And then more generally, what are you seeing from Wellthy's client employee base, and does it match up with what AARP is reporting?
Well, great questions. And definitely, so on the hospital side of things, on the healthcare side of things, we've seen healthcare workers, we talk about the sandwich generation. We're typically talking about individuals who look a lot like me, kids in the home and taking care of parents or in-laws or grandparents, other family members. And we talk about the squeeze for the sandwich generation. Hospital workers, health system workers are squeezed in an additional way. They're oftentimes, they're dealing with all the same issues that the rest of the workforce is dealing with. They similarly have parents and kids and spouses and others they're taking care of. They also have their patients. And so we see that these folks are just especially stressed and squeezed by the impact of caregiving. But yeah, we've seen within our families that we support and the employers that we work with, very similar dynamics to what the AARP report showed. It's been, caregiving was always complicated, and the pandemic made caregiving just that much more complicated. Caregivers are like one event away from just a full-blown breakdown, and whether that's a global pandemic or a natural disaster or a stressful political environment or even kind of social unrest, let alone having all of those in 1 year on top of caring for loved ones and juggling your career, it's just a lot. And so I get it. I mean, I think the stats make a ton of sense.
Yeah. I mean, you bring up a great point. Caregiving doesn't happen in a vacuum, and especially in today's times, it happens amid so many other major challenges. And the workforce is really the place that we go to for support on a number of these issues. And as I think it was JD mentioned, we're not even going to the office, so it becomes that much more challenging for employers to support us. And Tricia, you talk about caregiving as a recruitment tool, right? Can you expand on that and why it's so important?
Sure. Well, JD and Laurance referenced this earlier, but sort of attributing to that Great Resignation piece is the need, the tight labor market right now, even tighter than before in certain industries for sure. And with that tight labor market, employees are reevaluating their own situations and seeing if they can get sort of more flexibility, more benefits, more pay in other jobs. And we saw some record numbers in people quitting their jobs in the spring. In September of last year, we saw a large number of women leaving the workforce. I think the U.S. Labor Department referenced something like 2 to 3 million at one point. And so there is this sort of Great Resignation happening, and one way to curb that is to use caregiving offerings, supports, and benefits as a recruitment and retention tool. Let's not just think about the new employees that you want to attract, but keeping the existing employees and top talent that you have right now. That comes with such institutional knowledge, experience that translates into costs that impact your bottom line if you end up having to lose a large number of top talent. Things like healthcare costs, for example, and turnover costs, retraining, recruiting, interviewing, all of that takes time. And there really is a sort of bottom line return on investment for you to invest in keeping your top talent, but then also trying to attract and compete in that labor market. There's a war for talent right now, and if you want that competitive edge, you have to sort of play at the same level playing field.
Totally. And just to put some numbers around the Great Resignation, the data shows that 4 million Americans quit their jobs in July alone, and that trend is continuing, and there are 10.9 million jobs open right now. The other thing Tricia touched on, without saying the word, but is the she session that we've been experiencing this past year as women have been clearly significantly impacted by the pandemic and caregiving, but it's more than a women's issue. And Lindsay, you and I spoke the other day about equity and DE&I, which is also another really important issue for the workplace to address. What's the intersection there?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Liz. So it's, we love seeing companies talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that's awesome. But the word equity is really important here because it talks about allowing employees to bring their best selves to work. And so the caregivers clearly are struggling with that. And then on top of it, we do see that 3 in 5 caregivers are still women. And we know that adding to your stats, Liz, it's roughly 3 million women who have left the workforce voluntarily since the start of the pandemic, we think due to caregiving. We also see that Black and Latinx caregivers are more likely to be in high intensity care situations. And those folks report spending more hours per week on care than other groups. So, as companies think about their DE&I programs and initiatives, I think a miss is not considering the impact of caregiving on different constituents, different folks within a workforce.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent point. The other thing that jumped out for me from the report was that caregivers are so concerned about exposing people that they care for. And I don't remember if it was Laurance or JD, but they touched on, we're facing so much uncertainty around the workplace model too right now. Are we going back to the office? And again, not all caregivers work in an office. Some of them work in healthcare settings and other places. But are we going back to the office? Is it going to be hybrid? Are we going to continue to work from home? Lindsay, can you talk a little bit about how do employers and how do caregivers navigate with that huge uncertainty?
Yeah, so we have a lot of clients that are wrestling with this very difficult decision. I was with the CEO of Hearst this morning. We were talking about return to office, and it's challenging because there's so many benefits to being in an office setting, obviously, together with colleagues. But for caregivers, there are additional considerations. Certainly the safety aspect is a big one. And it's not just employees who are concerned about COVID exposure in the workplace. It's people who are concerned about, here in New York City, it's concerned about exposure on the subway, or on the bus, however you get to work. So it's concern about exposure. The other issue is setting up care. We have a massive care supply shortage in our country right now. And if you have an older adult or a loved one who's in your home or who's living independently, who you're taking care of, it is very concerning thinking about the risk of bringing someone into the home in in-home care, or moving them into a more supportive living environment like a long-term care facility. And so that's like another weight that's on top of caregivers, is if I do go back into the office and I'm not able to be there more freely to kind of spend time with my loved ones, what are my options for care? Can I even find care? Can I afford care? And is the care even safe? Right? So that's just adding to the mental load. Add on top of that, the kind of timing issues. We've been in this, period of okay, everybody's going to go back to the office in the fall. And then that got pushed back because of the Delta variant. Many companies are leaving it kind of open-ended. It might be in November, it might be in January. Well, that state of uncertainty is really stressful for caregivers who are trying to plan ahead, trying to set up the right support infrastructure. I'll add one more point. I promise I'll stop talking after that. But the one final point that I'll mention is this notion of hybrid workforces. I love the notion of a hybrid workforce that's flexible, allows people to come in when it works for them. Some companies are considering putting more structure around that, coming in certain days of the week, certain weeks of the month. That's very challenging for caregivers. It's very hard to find care for 2 days out of the week or 2 weeks out of the month. And so that's causing a lot of stress and concern for caregivers too.
Yeah, and you mentioned the word uncertainty, and I noticed Laureen, that's what she said. She was in such a period of uncertainty. Her story really highlighted all of this. So Tricia, you're out and you're engaging with employers, as is Wellthy, I know, but what are you seeing? And you said something to me when we were talking last week that the magic is in the middle. So given everything that Lindsay just set up, what do employers, what do they do? And how do they pull this support through?
I think it's a couple of tactics. It's, offering benefits, supports, tangible resources is one aspect of it. And then there's that cultural change that's happening, that needs to happen in order to reduce stigma, if any, was there in the workplace about being open about your caregiving situation. It's a little bit different with elder care than it is with having a baby. For example, it's a little bit more planned. You have 9 months beforehand before someone has to take leave. And with caregiving for older adults, it's not as predictable. And there's that uncertainty again. And so people have not been as upfront and wanting to disclose their caregiving situations as much because of fear of, will they be turned down for promotion? Will they look like they're not dedicated to their job? When you're mortified if someone in your home pops into your Zoom because it may look like you're completely distracted. All those kinds of things kind of go around the culture of acceptance. And I think I mentioned the magic is in the middle because I think middle level management and managers are so critical to providing and that culture so that their teams could thrive. But I sympathize with middle level managers because that's a lot on their plate. They want to be able to do the right thing and provide as much flexibility and time needed to the people on their team who may need that support. But then they're responsible for their business objectives. And how can you continue to do those two and feel empowered to offer that kind of flexibility while still feeling confident that you're going to meet your business goals? And I think that's where, AARP can come in and help with some of those training resources to really help managers backfill. And how can the train keep moving while you're empowered to provide that flexibility? You can have the best policy in the world in your organization when it comes to providing caregiving supports to both parents and people who are caring for older adults. But if managers and supervisors aren't aware of the policy or the benefits that they offer, or don't feel like they can provide that flexibility, what's the point? A lot of times the direct supervisor plays such a critical role. And we also sympathize and feel like we need to help provide that support in order to make them feel empowered to be able to offer the flexibility and be the manager they want to be.
Yeah, such a good point. And I lived experience on that one as well. And well, there's so many places I want to take this conversation next on that. But Lindsay, one of the things that I think Wellthy has to deal with all the time is making sure that those middle managers, and I know you have to as well, Tricia, but know what's available so that, so lots of companies are trying to do the right thing, but then it has to be communicated, right? And merchandised in the company. And one of the things that isn't always the answer is paid leave, right? So I know there's a multiple part question there, or maybe no question, but multiple part discussion there. Like, paid leave, it's not the be all and end all, is it? And so how do we pull through the things Tricia was just talking about?
Well, I love everything that Tricia just talked about, and I couldn't agree more. And middle level management is great. I love that AARP is doing some training there. It's awesome. And I'll make a couple other additional points there. I think, one thing companies can do is just encourage managers, encourage leaders to model the behavior, to help model kind of that caregiving's normal, that we all experience caregiving, to help destigmatize, to help normalize. My example is that, I have a mother-in-law who's in a rehab facility right now. I just lost my grandfather a month ago. And I've been very vocal, sharing kind of all of this with my team, anybody I talk to, just opening up, sharing my story, sharing my struggles, putting on my calendar that I'm visiting, my mother-in-law and my grandfather, and just making a part of the dialogue so that hopefully folks feel comfortable sharing back. I do feel strongly that open communication, that culture of care, it's really critical. I agree with the point that you made, Liz. I feel strongly that paid leave is a beautiful solution for so many things, to support bonding with a new baby, to be there for an individual when they lose a loved one, for bereavement, to give an employee some time if there's a miscarriage. There's so many newer and really powerful ways to use leave. I will say that I don't think leave is the right solution for caregivers, because we see caregivers using leave as a last resort. They're up to their eyeballs, they're drained, they have a massive to-do list, they're overwhelmed, and they're saying, I can't physically do it anymore. I need to take a leave. The problem with that is a short-term fix that needs to continue to be, most caregiving situations will continue for years, if not decades. I was involved in my mom's care for 30 years. If I had taken a leave, I could have dug out of my hole, and then I would have probably needed another leave to continue to do so as things piled up. So one of the innovations that I've seen, of course, offering support like what AARP does. Wellthy is a very powerful benefit. We work with a lot of top companies, but we are seeing companies, and I'll give a shout out. I actually don't know if I'm allowed to, but there's an organization, I'll say which one, Merck. Workday is doing this too, but they're starting to offer Caregiving Pto, which I think so simple, but it's actually very brilliant, because when people need to take time off for caregiving, it's usually those half days or usually those full days. Right now, caregivers are using their vacation time or using their sick time for caregiving duties. The problem with that is then burnout becomes an issue. So if you can allocate, like these companies are doing 10 days out of the year that are meant just for caregiving, and they can be used in chunks, half days or full days. That's a kind of more innovative solution that we're seeing companies implement.
Yeah, and that speaks to another issue that you and I have talked about in the past, which is we tend to think about caregiving in the workplace as an absenteeism issue. But what about presenteeism? Like, how do you get the work done when your mind is elsewhere?
Totally.
Yeah.
I mean, caregiving, I mentioned I was involved in my mom's care, and even more recently this summer with my mother-in-law and my grandfather. The emotional burden of caregiving is something that goes under-discussed. Individuals who are caregiving feel this really intense range of emotions, everything from sadness and grief. You're grieving the loss of everything, the loss of ability, the loss of mobility, the loss of cognitive, whatever it is, as well as dealing with resentment. Oftentimes there's family dynamics, loss of sleep, lack of sleep, and feeling just in general like you're not doing enough for all the different people in your life. It's a very exhausting and draining, fully consuming experience to be a caregiver. And so the impact of that is we do see that caregivers come to work distracted. They're checking their texts to make sure to see what the results were from a test, or they're about to hop on a plane to be there for mom if they get word that they need, they're not coming to work feeling like things are in control and they can really be focused. And so that has major ramifications for certain roles. If you have workers who are in roles in an oil and gas company or a public utility company where they need to be incredibly focused for the safety of themselves and maybe their colleagues, any tiny bit of distraction is key. Same thing for in a hospital setting. So, I think I'd love to see us talk more about that impact of caregiving on presenteeism, on distraction, and the result that could potentially have, especially on certain types of workers.
Yeah. We talk a lot about the need to create a culture of caregiving. And Tricia, I'm curious, what your thoughts are on how we do that. How do we create this culture?
I mean, everything Lindsay said, you just see me just nodding my head big time, right? I'm in the sandwich generation as well, and you can definitely feel the pressure from all sides. And we actually call it at AARP, not the sandwich generation, the panini generation, because you're literally squished. And of course, the pandemic just made it just exacerbated everything with school and all the other issues too. I think, touching on absenteeism absenteeism versus presenteeism, there are solutions that are no cost, low cost, that are things that you can implement to, again, contribute to that more caregiver friendly culture where it's not a bad thing if you have to sneak off and take a call with the doctor of someone who you're caring for during working hours, which is the only time when you can call them, rather than have to go hide in, the stairwell. Is there a space that's dedicated where you can create, like, it's okay for you to go in there if you need to do those kinds of things? And just, having more open discussions with your manager, being feeling confident that you can share your experiences when you are feeling completely stretched, and just sort of being able to talk it out, I think is an important thing. I'll offer sort of a flip side to the presenteeism aspect, and that is the idea when you're thinking about recruiting and hiring people who, let's say, look like they have these gaps in their resumes and they may have taken time off or had to quit their jobs for caregiving. Sometimes that doesn't come up in the algorithms when you're hiring and doing talent management, and there might be this red flag for the gaps. But I encourage employers to kind of look at those gaps and offer those questions. Caregivers actually do have, if someone had to step away for a period of time because of caregiving, caregivers have absolutely wonderful transferable skills from their caregiving duties that they can apply in the workplace. They are probably the best project managers that I know. They're probably the best at negotiating and communicating and advocating for their loved ones. Time management. Sometimes, yes, you feel absolutely stressed and you can't do it, but you see the coordination and the organization. A lot of that can be transferred to things that you do in the workplace. And so I always want to point that out, that we say, if you want to get something done, find a busy person, and caregivers are exactly that. And there's a reason for that. Often one person in the family is the person that steps up and it becomes the primary caregiver, quarterbacking everything. And those people are going to be probably the busiest and most stressed, but they often are ones who have honed those skills that could be applicable and useful in the workplace. So just something just to not sort of knock off right away. And if you're in this mode of sort of hiring and looking for talent and looking at different resumes, it's something that I mention a lot because it's something that you don't really hear about, but it's absolutely, I've seen it, and I've seen my own skills that I do in my caregiving job apply in the workplace for sure.
Heard it here first. Why caregivers make great hires. Yes, yes, yes. I know we have some questions coming up, so I just want to ask you both if you have anything, anything you want to add before we turn it back over to Laurance and see if people among the participants have some questions for us. And so Tricia, anything you want to share that we didn't cover, or I'm giving you an or my question, which is, can we be optimistic about how employers are going to support caregivers in the future? Your choice.
I think I'll do an and. I'd say yes, we can be optimistic. And I think because the thing that I wanted to add is that there's organizations and companies and service providers like those of us here who are here to help. AARP, this is all part of our social mission aspect where we're trying to help employers, not just from the influencing and encouraging piece of things because it's the right thing to do, but also on the practical side of things. We want to equip employers with tools and resources to help make it easier for you to implement. We have things like do-it-yourself events in a box. We have the manager training course, all of these kinds of things that you can do to offer caregivers themselves, consumer-based information, resources, referral lists. Those are things that you can just sort of take and go. And those are all available on our website, aarp.org/employer caregiving.
Thank you. Thank you. And Lindsay, and either or for you two, anything you want to address before we turn the program over, what do you think we're going to be talking about with regards to this topic 1 year from now?
Well, I'll answer both quickly. So the thing that we didn't talk about is just, I know this is an audience on this call of mostly employers, and I want to give a big kudos and shout out to the employers on this call because benefits individuals, HR leaders have been frontline workers through the past through the last 20 months or whatever it's been, responding to a lot of intense employee needs. It's caregiving, but it's caregiving on top of substance abuse and homelessness and domestic abuse and all sorts of other incredibly complicated issues. And we are so encouraged. We work with incredible clients. We get the privilege of seeing up close and personal benefits leaders who are so dedicated to their workforce and doing really profound things. So thank you, and big kudos and shout out. In terms of what we're going to be talking about a year from now, I think the caregiving topic. So, Wellthy's seen our business explode in the last 2 years. We tripled last year. We tripled the year before. We'll double this year, double the next year. But the big trend for us is interest and excitement from health plans. So we're encouraged to see health insurance companies and other constituents within the healthcare system that are embracing caregivers, which I'm so thrilled about. All the things that the healthcare system loves, reduce costs and reduce readmissions, reduce hospitalizations. Caregivers are your partner, your secret tool, your asset in helping to achieve all of those. And so what's to come for Wellthy, and then also what's to come, I think, in general within the healthcare system, is more visibility, more acknowledgement, more recognition for caregivers, and more embracing of those caregivers by kind of the traditional healthcare players. That's my part hope and part crystal ball.
Excellent. Thank you both. It really is a silver lining conversation, right, when it comes to the pandemic and caregiving. And with that, Laurance, I'll turn it back over to you.
Sure. Well, thank you. Thank you all for a great conversation. I do have a few questions. Some of them got answered as, I don't know whether you guys were just sort of hearing people's questions. My favorite one that I was going to lead off on was, this was sort of a bleak conversation about all the burden on caregivers. Why should we hire caregivers? And Tricia, I thought your answer was great. Is there anything that anybody would add around that particular aspect of, why is it that, what do caregivers bring to the table that others may not?
One more point I'll add to that mix is we were talking about DEI, and caregivers are as diverse as they come, and there are disparities, as we know, that caregivers face. I think when you think about talent, you want that diversity, and women, making sure that women stay in the workforce, that's another sort of angle to look at it. Caregiving is not traditionally thought of as a DEI issue, but because of the fact of the disparities within it, and also the fact that there has been so much more of a focus throughout the past decades on childcare and maternity leave, parental leave. I think we're now seeing an acceleration of more supports for elder care, but it still continues to lag behind. And so we're really encouraging employers to think about caregiving as a DEI issue and to think of your caregivers holistically, not just focus your services and offerings to one subset of caregivers, just the parents of young children, but also think about what's the equitable benefit that you could offer to someone who's caring for an older adult so that they do feel comfortable sharing their experience, that there is more, my prediction for next year is that there's going to be more of a self-identification and disclosure of who's a caregiver in the workforce. And I think because that's, again, one of the silver linings of this pandemic is that these issues are sort of more brought to the forefront.
The other thing I would add is you also, as an employer, you can't get around it. I mean, look at the data, right? 10,000 people turning 65 every day, people living longer, therefore living with chronic illnesses, the shortage of paid caregivers that Lindsay talked about. I mean, I love what Tricia had to say about why you should hire a caregiver. But the other thing is you will be hiring a caregiver, or you won't be hiring.
Or you have already and just didn't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's, sorry, Lindsay, I didn't want to cut you off. Okay.
No, I didn't. I will add one tiny little detail, which is Joe Fuller at HBS, who runs the Future of Work. He's doing phenomenal work on this. And part of his interest in caregiving was when he studied the future of work, and he looked at the roles of the future and identified that the roles of the future, as automation eats all of our jobs, the roles that will be left are going to be highly skilled, highly empathetic, will require highly skilled, highly empathetic roles. That led him to who are the right people to fill highly skilled, highly empathetic roles. That led him to realizing that it's caregivers. And so, I couldn't agree more with everything that Tricia and Liz said. And I'll just add that element of empathy to project management and communication, all the time management, all the other skills. So I love that idea of looking to recruit and hire caregivers.
Hey, Laurance, and just to jump in on that,
Yeah.
first of all, that was an outstanding conversation. I just want to congratulate the three of you. This notion of empathy that Lindsay just brought up is one that we heard quite a bit from our members. We had one who said that leaders are going to have to be much more empathetic in how they drive their companies in order to recruit and retain talent, which is the point that I think Tricia had made earlier. And what we're finding is that employees are looking for certain characteristics of an employer. And like I said before, they hold the cards, right? Employees right now hold the cards. The balance of power has shifted in the hiring dynamic to employees. And they're looking for diversity in their companies. They're looking for social responsibility, sustainability, but more and more, they're looking for a culture of empathy. And leaders are understanding that. Business leaders are understanding that and building that culture. And a piece of that, I saw somebody had asked a question about how do I approach my employer about this? And in a culture of empathy, it wouldn't be hard to do that, right? And so I think it's sort of connecting a few dots of what has been said. But I think it's really important to highlight that point that Lindsay just made about empathy.
Agreed.
Yeah, I'm going, sorry.
But Lindsay also made the point about grief and that caregivers, well before anybody passing away are dealing with grief. And so that's going to tie into this empathetic workforce that you're talking about, JD.
Yeah, absolutely.
Part of and sort of, I don't know if it's an expansion on this, but this culture of support for caregivers, empathy, and so on, I think also leads into a little bit of my last question, which is, we've talked a lot about relatively, maybe sort of very professional companies or larger companies offering caregiving benefits and so on. If I'm at a smaller employer and I've got limited benefit packages, what can I as an employer do to support caregivers? And sort of on the flip side of that, what are a few things that employers can do of any size that don't cost a fortune? We started down this path a little bit in the paid leave isn't everything. Lindsay, you talked a little bit about sort of normalizing a culture of caregiving and talking with your team, but are there other things that an employer with limited sort of benefits can do that don't cost a fortune that everybody would recommend?
I mean, I am an employer of a small organization, so I can tell you what we're doing. Not saying we figured it all out, but we think a lot about it. So we have about 270 people. And, I think a couple of things that we do. So one, we offer Wellthy, obviously, internally. So making sure that our team members have access to concierge level support. We call it concierge. It sounds fancy, but it's really just that partnership, that hand holding, the expertise, guidance, and that partner to get things done. So all of our team members have Wellthy and take advantage of it. It's really interesting. We have care coordinators, so experts on our team who have multiple care projects where they're working, because sometimes, you need, even if you're a pro, even if you know what you're doing, having the extra set of hands or just the objective third party is key. So that's one critical thing is offering Wellthy. It doesn't have to be Wellthy, whatever, there are awesome other programs out there. Second thing is, the bigger companies have started doing these caregiving ERGs, which are very powerful, allowing individuals to connect. In a smaller company, whether you use, we use Slack. So we have Slack groups for kind of different groups within the company, all different groups, parents, caregivers, whatever, to allow individuals to connect, share, vent, whatever that looks like. And then the third is just that culture of care, normalizing caregiving, talking about it, making sure people know that it's okay to be on camera, on Zoom with kids, pets, older adults in the background. That's life. It is what it is. So really working hard at kind of showing that culture of care and embedding that into everything we do. So those are some of the things we're doing.
What's funny, Laurance, is early on in the pandemic, the default answer from employers was flexibility, right? That's what everybody said, we'll just give flexibility. And I think as these 18 months have gone on, flexibility means something very different to the employer than it does to the employee. To the employee, it means, oh my God, I have to work at 5 a.m. before my kids get up. I have to work after midnight when I'm done with my caregiving responsibilities, if they're during the day. And employers have been forced to get much more sophisticated about that. And they're doing things like what Lindsay just laid out. But, flexibility is great, but it needs to be managed, or else it leads to the stress and mental health and wellness issues that I was talking about earlier.
Yeah, with those blurred lines. If I may add just more resources for small business owners. We know that there's this whole huge spectrum, right? A small business can be employees of 5 or less, or 200 or less. So depending on what resources are available. The no cost, low cost resources that I was referring to, certainly the things that Lindsay mentioned, the culture of change, flexibility often doesn't cost anything to just change how and when you work or where. But I'd also add the things like the trainings and the lists of free resources that you can provide. Caregiving is very local. So if you know of the local organizations, nonprofits, the local AAAs, the Area Agency on Aging in the area, and at least referring to those local resources, that could be one step to kind of help alleviate that search, that Google search that like a caregiver in crisis is trying to look up and just don't know where to start. So again, AARP has a lot of those for caregiving consumers, but I think just providing a list of resources is a good first step. The ERGs, absolutely. If there's an affinity group type of support group that you could recommend for a caregiver, that's another way. We're seeing so many employees turning in. There's no virtual water cooler, there's no water cooler anymore. It is these sort of virtual settings. And we've seen this uptick in people finding support amongst their peers, people that they didn't know were in the same exact boat that they were in.
Well, Liz, any final words of advice for employers as you, as in your work, what you see in terms of folks working with employers?
The only thing I would add, and maybe we can explore, we can all get together again and explore this topic, but not just creating a culture of care, but talking about and thinking about what corporate culture means now in relation to caregiving. I think that's something that we should also just throw into the think tank. And what does it mean if we're hybrid, if we have an employee base of caregivers, what does culture look like now? So I'll just leave that out there.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. Thank you all very much. This has been a great conversation. And thanks to the audience for joining us. Thanks to the presenters for sharing. Thanks, Laureen is off camera now, for sharing her story. We, as I mentioned, we do post these videos for folks, so you can find them later. The Caregiver Coalition we're always encouraging folks to join the coalition. It is a easy thing to do. All you have to do is let us know that you want to, and your organization is basically committing to recognize, honor, and support caregivers. If you do want to join us, email us at info@macaregivercoalition.org, and we'll get you going. A couple of quick announcements before we go. We are looking to hold a in-person anniversary event in November in the Boston area, so look for it'll be during National Caregiver Family Caregiver Awareness Month, and so look for details on that coming out to our mailing list. So join our mailing list and join this. For coalition members, also keep your eyes out. One of the things we talked about is, it is sometimes hard for caregivers to share with their employer that they are actually a caregiver, for fear of maybe missing out on promotions or other opportunities. One of the things that we're trying to do is help employers understand, that there really are possibly more caregivers within their organization than they may be aware of. So we'll be rolling out a tool to help members understand the caregiving intensity at their own organization. We'll be announcing that in the next week, and we'd love coalition members to share it with your employees, and we'll gather data that we can share at the November event. Finally, just fill out the post-event survey that will pop up after you leave the webinar, as you can see on the art card that Paul just popped up here. So thank you.